There's a particular kind of silence that only certain people know. Not the silence of a Sunday morning, or the silence of a finished task, or the comfortable quiet that settles over a life that has been well held by others. This is a different kind. It is the silence that greets you after you have tried again without anyone watching. After you have made a decision that no one validated, moved in a direction that no one endorsed, and arrived somewhere that no one celebrated with you. It is the silence of the unsupported life. And if you have lived inside it long enough, you know that it has a texture, a weight. It presses on you in ways that are difficult to explain to people who have never felt it, because from the outside, your life might look like simply a harder version of everyone else's. Same ambition, same effort, different terrain. What you carry that they do not is the persistent suspicion, sometimes quiet, sometimes deafening, that the playing field was arranged before you arrived, that someone else got the mentor, the network, the family who showed up, the early belief that made all the difference, and you got the open road with nothing behind you and no map. This video is not going to tell you that the suspicion is wrong. It isn't. But it is going to tell you something that is, in the long run, far more useful. That Carl Jung, one of the most profound psychological thinkers of the 20th century, spent a significant portion of his life mapping the territory you are moving through. And what he found there, in the wreckage of his own unsupported period, in the depths of what he called the confrontation with the unconscious, was not tragedy. It was a blueprint, hidden, demanding, and available only to those who have run out of the alternative. By the end of this, you will understand what that blueprint actually contains. You will understand why the path you have been walking, despite everything, may be producing something in you that the easier road structurally cannot. You will also understand the two places where most people in your position lose everything, not to circumstance, but to the two most tempting psychological exits that appear when the pressure becomes extreme. This is not a comfort video, but it may be the most honest thing you hear this year. The self that was built for you. Before we can talk about what you are building, we need to talk about what most people are walking around with, and why they have never had to question it. Jung observed something that takes a moment to fully land. The version of themselves that most people experience as their identity is not something they constructed. It is something they accumulated, layer by layer, over years of being told who they were, what they were capable of, whether they were worth investing in. The confidence that a person with good support carries does not originate inside them. It originates in the steady, repeated experience of being confirmed by others, by parents, by teachers, by institutions, by the mentor who took a chance, by the friend group that reflected their worth back at them in 1,000 small moments. Over time, that external confirmation gets absorbed. It moves inward. It begins to feel like self-belief, like identity, like something the person generated independently. And because the process is slow and seamless, because the original architecture is invisible by the time it is complete, they never have reason to examine it. The confidence feels earned. The sense of self feels solid. The direction feels chosen. What Jung recognized is that this process, while entirely normal, produces a self that has one significant vulnerability. It depends, at a structural level, on the continuation of the conditions that built it. Remove the external mirrors, remove the professional identity, the relationships, the institutional standing, the steady diet of other people's belief, and something strange happens. The self becomes uncertain of itself. Not because the person is weak, but because the architecture they were living inside was always partly external. They didn't know how much work the scaffolding was doing because the scaffolding never fell. Jung discovered this not as a theory, but as a lived catastrophe. In 1913, he severed his relationship with Sigmund Freud. At the time, Freud was not simply a colleague, He was the gravitational center of the psychoanalytic world, the man whose approval had given Jung's work its legitimacy, whose network had opened every significant professional door Jung had walked through. The break was intellectual, but its consequences were total. The institutional world that had been organizing Jung's professional identity withdrew. Colleagues distanced themselves. The framework within which Jung had understood his own significance dissolved. What remained was Jung alone, with his ideas, with his patience, with a mind that had been producing work of extraordinary originality, but with no external structure left to tell him whether any of it was worth anything. What he went through in that period, which he later documented in what became known as the Red Book, was not depression in the ordinary sense. It was a crisis of self-knowledge. Stripped of the mirrors that had been reflecting his worth, he found he had to go somewhere to locate himself that he had never had to go before. Inward, completely inward, into a confrontation with the layers of his psyche that the busy, supported, institutionally embedded life had never required him to face. He did not emerge from this period quickly. He emerged from it transformed. And what he built from what he found, the framework of individuation, the map of the unconscious, the theory of the shadow, became the foundation of everything that would make him one of the most original thinkers of the modern era. None of it would have existed if the scaffolding had held. This is the first thing the blueprint reveals. What feels like your poverty may be the precise condition under which something that supported lives cannot produce is being forced into existence. The shadow and what lives in your silence. Here's a question worth sitting with. When the noise stops, what do you hear? Most people never find out. Not because they have found some enlightened relationship with silence, but because they have arranged their lives, consciously or not, so that silence rarely arrives. There are the obligations, the plans, the devices, the relationships that generate constant signal. There is always something to respond to, something to anticipate, something to manage. The busyness is functional. It is doing a job. That job is to prevent a specific kind of encounter, not with failure, not with other people, but with the unexamined interior. Jung named what lives in that unexamined space. He called it the shadow. The shadow is not simply the dark side of a person, the impulses they are ashamed of, the emotions they have learned to suppress. It is larger and stranger than that. It contains everything the psyche has been unwilling to integrate, the unlived possibilities, the authentic desires that were traded away in exchange for approval or survival, the version of the self that was present before the performance began, before you learned what you needed to be in order to be acceptable, valued, safe. For most people with rich external support structures, the shadow remains, in Jung's language, a theoretical concern. They read about it. They find it interesting. But the noise of their supported life keeps them insulated from a direct encounter with it. The social world absorbs the silence before it can become revealing. For the unsupported person, the insulation is thin. When the external world does not hold you up, does not fill your calendar with its demands and affirmations, the quiet comes whether you invite it or not. And in that quiet, the shadow does not stay politely theoretical. It surfaces, not dramatically usually, more like a persistent low-frequency signal that begins to interfere with the story you have been telling yourself about why you are doing what you are doing and what you actually want. What frequently surfaces for people who have built their drive in the absence of support is this. Underneath what they have been calling ambition is something rawer, something closer to defiance. The hunger to succeed is real. The hours are real. The discipline is real. But underneath all of it, if you press honestly, is often a wound wearing the costume of an engine. The need to prove to every person who did not show up, to every system that overlooked you, to every closed door that did not open, that their absence was not the final word on your worth. That is not a foundation. It is a bruise. And Jung's observation about the shadow, one of his most uncomfortable, is that it does not care how productive your wound has made you. It will not be satisfied by achievement. It will not recede when you succeed. It will keep surfacing, louder and in stranger forms, until you turn and look at it directly, not to be destroyed by it, not to drown in it, but to recognize it for what it is, not the truth about you, but the evidence of what you have been carrying without acknowledgement. There is a distinction that Jung drew with great care, and it is one that may change how you understand your own situation. He distinguished between loneliness and solitude, two states that share the same external appearance and have almost nothing else in common. Loneliness is what happens when you are isolated and you fight it, when you are in the silence and you experience it as proof of your unworthiness, as evidence that the world has correctly assessed your value and found it insufficient. Loneliness is corrosive because it is passive. You are not choosing anything. You are simply suffering the condition. Solitude is the active, conscious decision to remain in the encounter with your own interior, not because it is comfortable, but because you understand that what the silence contains is real, and that what the noise was covering up was real, and that there is no version of becoming yourself that does not require going through this particular door. Loneliness keeps you small. Solitude builds. The difference between them is not your circumstances. Two people in identical isolation can be in entirely different psychological territory. What separates them is whether the silence is being experienced as something happening to them, or as something they are choosing to move through consciously. You may not have chosen the silence, but you can choose what you do inside it. Necessity as the engine. Let us be direct about something that the more comfortable versions of this conversation tend to obscure. Jung was not a sentimentalist about suffering. He did not believe that difficulty was inherently instructive, or that struggle automatically produces growth, or that there is some cosmic justice system that compensates the unsupported with hidden gifts. He had no patience for that kind of thinking. What he observed, as a clinician, as a theorist, and as a man who had lived through the collapse of his own external structure, was something more specific and more demanding. He observed that the psyche is, by nature, conservative. It will not change if it does not have to. It will not do the hard, disorienting work of genuine development as long as the environment provides a comfortable alternative. Give a person enough structure, enough validation, enough borrowed certainty, and the deeper layers of who they might be will simply wait, indefinitely. The scaffolding holds the unfinished interior in place as reliably as it holds the parts that are complete. What forces the deeper work is necessity, not difficulty in the abstract, not the ordinary friction of a challenging life. The specific kind of necessity that arrives when the outward path, the path that runs toward other people's approval, other people's maps, other people's assessment of what you are worth, has genuinely closed. When you cannot borrow confidence because no one is offering it, when you cannot inherit direction because no one with authority over your life is pointing anywhere, when the question of who you are and whether you are capable has to be answered not by looking outward because there is nothing there, but by going somewhere else entirely. Jung called the process that this forces individuation. It is the movement of the psyche toward wholeness, not the curated, socially acceptable wholeness of a person who has integrated only the approved parts of themselves, but the full, difficult, sometimes confronting wholeness of a person who has been forced to reckon with everything. The rejected parts, the unlived possibilities, the authentic values that were buried under what they needed to be to survive. Individuation is not a comfortable process. It does not proceed in a straight line. It does not announce its milestones. Most of the time, from the inside, it feels less like growth and more like being taken apart and uncertain whether reassembly is coming. But here is what it produces when a person moves through it consciously rather than being simply ground down by it. A self that is genuinely their own, not borrowed, not contingent on external conditions, not dependent on the continuation of any particular relationship, institution, or source of validation. A self that knows what it is made of because it had to locate its own materials. A self that trusts its own judgment, not as a philosophical position, but as an earned reality, because it has been making calls in genuine uncertainty and living inside the results without anyone to validate the decision or absorb the consequences. Think about what every difficult decision made without endorsement has actually been doing. It has been running a proof, a repeating experiment with a consistent result. Your judgment exists and can function independently. You do not need external permission to act. You do not need confirmation that the direction is correct before you move. You have been demonstrating this to yourself, iteration after iteration, in conditions that offered no alternative. That is not a small thing. Most people never demonstrate it at all, because the scaffolding catches them before the fall becomes long enough to be informative. The two traps. Here is where the blueprint becomes a warning. Necessity without consciousness does not produce individuation. It produces one of two things, two traps, equally convincing from the inside, equally destructive in the long run. And both of them are waiting somewhere on the path that you are walking. The first trap is what happens when the genuine injustice of your situation, and it is genuinely unjust, there is no need to pretend otherwise, calcifies into identity. When the accurate observation that you have been moving through harder terrain than others becomes the organizing principle of your psychology. When you begin to interpret every obstacle as confirmation of the original wound, every failure as evidence that the game was rigged before you played, every setback as proof that effort without support is futile. This is not realism. It wears the costume of realism. It has the vocabulary of clear-eyed assessment and structural critique. But what it is, underneath the intellectual packaging, is a closed system. A system in which no new information can arrive that does not get recruited as further evidence of the original conclusion. Jung understood bitterness as a particular kind of psychological armor, one that protects against the vulnerability of continuing to try in the open. If the outcome is already determined by forces outside your control, then your failures are not really yours to examine. And quietly, neither are your possibilities. The bitterness that feels like it is directed at the world is always also directed inward. It closes something. It prevents the very development it is, in some sense, mourning the conditions for. The second trap is its mirror, and it is subtler. It is the trap of the person who has been hurt by absence long enough that they stop reaching, and then, rather than grieving the reaching, constructs an entire philosophy around the not reaching. Independence becomes an ideology. The refusal to need anyone becomes a badge of identity. Solitude becomes armor rather than process. And the person who once genuinely needed connection, was denied it, and was wounded by the denial, now insists, with complete conviction, that they never needed it at all. Jung was explicit in his account of the period following his break with Freud, that what kept him from collapsing was not an embrace of heroic isolation. It was the conscious maintenance of real, if limited, human anchors. His family, his clinical practice, the small, genuine connections that kept him tethered to the world while the interior work proceeded. He did not romanticize aloneness. He endured it with intention, while resisting the temptation to make a virtue of what was, at bottom, a necessary difficulty. The person who builds the wall of heroic self-sufficiency does not become stronger. They become more defended. And defended is not the same as developed. Defense consumes enormous energy that could be going toward construction. It requires constant maintenance, and it leaves behind a kind of brittleness that is, ironically, more fragile than the openness it replaced, because it has never been tested by genuine contact. What both traps share is a common root, an unconscious response to pain that bypasses the actual work. The bitter person makes the external world fully responsible and stops there. The isolated hero makes the self fully sufficient and stops there. Both are telling a story that is simpler than the reality. Both are, in Jung's language, refusing the tension that genuine individuation requires. That tension is this: the circumstances that have shaped your path are genuinely unjust, and you possess genuine agency within them. Both of these things are true simultaneously, not one or the other. Both held in full conflict without the relief of collapsing into either. That tension is not comfortable. It is not meant to be. It is the exact condition under which the real interior work happens. What you are actually building. Let us talk plainly about the asymmetry. People with substantial external support frequently progress faster. This is real. Networks convert effort into opportunity at rates that raw ability alone cannot match. Early belief produces a kind of momentum that is self-reinforcing. Resources compress timelines. Mentors open doors that would have taken years to find otherwise. If you have watched this happen in real time, you have not been imagining it. But here is what also happens, and what is rarely examined with equivalent honesty. What support accelerates, it also shapes. And the shape it produces carries a hidden structural vulnerability that only becomes visible under specific pressure. Jung observed throughout his clinical work that the people most devastated by failure, by rejection, by the sudden removal of institutional standing or social position, were rarely the ones who had struggled from the beginning. They were the ones who had been well held and then weren't. When their scaffolding came down, the mentor who disappeared, the organization that dissolved, the relationship that had been doing the work of self-definition, what was revealed beneath it was often shockingly sparse. Not because the person was weak in character, but because the scaffolding had been performing functions they had never been required to develop for themselves. What you have been forced to build instead does not have a visible external form. It does not look like a credential or a connection or an institutional endorsement. It looks like something quieter and harder to name. It looks like this: a decision made in genuine uncertainty, without anyone to validate the direction, and the capacity to live with the consequences and continue. A failure absorbed without a net, a season of doubt metabolized in complete silence, and the discovery, at the bottom of that silence, of something that held. Not certainty, not confidence in the ordinary sense, something older, a recognition that you are still here and still oriented, without any external force having arranged that orientation. That process, repeated in the dark, without witnesses, without applause, without the structure of other people's belief to organize it, is the mechanism by which an interior architecture forms that no external force can dismantle, because no external force built it. In the development of personality, Jung describes the developed personality as something that cannot be reoriented by the withdrawal of approval, cannot be collapsed by the removal of external structures, cannot be shaken by collective panic or redirected by institutional pressure. Not because the person has become invulnerable. Jung was clear that genuine development increases sensitivity, not invulnerability, but because the foundation of who they are is not resting on anything that can be taken from outside. It was forged in the place those things cannot reach. That is the asymmetry that comparison does not capture. They may be building faster. You are building differently. And differently, in this specific case, means building something that belongs entirely to you. A self that was tested before it was claimed. Resilience that was demonstrated before it was named. Judgment that was exercised in conditions where the cost of error was real. Consciousness as the difference. But here is the risk that cannot be avoided. None of this is automatic. Pressure without consciousness does not produce a forged self. It produces a fractured one. The conditions you are living in are the conditions under which individuation becomes possible. They are not the conditions under which individuation is guaranteed. The difference between the person who moves through unsupported difficulty and comes out the other side with a self that is genuinely their own, and the person who moves through the same difficulty and is simply ground down by it, that difference is not talent. It is not luck. It is not even effort, though effort matters. It is consciousness. The willingness to understand what the process is actually doing, to name the traps before they close, to hold the tension without collapsing into bitterness or defensive isolation, to stay in the silence long enough to hear what it contains, rather than filling it with noise the moment it becomes uncomfortable. Endurance alone is not the destination. Jung was not interested in people who had simply survived difficulty. He was interested in what people had become through it, whether the pressure had been met with the kind of attention that transforms it into material, or simply been endured until it passed and left nothing behind but exhaustion and a story about what was survived. You have been enduring. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, the necessary precondition. But at some point, endurance has to become understanding. The capacity to look at what the conditions of your life have been constructing, consciously and without flinching, and to work with that construction deliberately. The question is not whether you can win without support. You may be able to. Many have. The deeper question, the one Jung would press you toward, is who you are becoming in the attempt. Because the victory that is won while the self remains unconscious of its own process is a hollow thing. It does not satisfy, not in any durable sense, because it was not actually you who won. It was the wound, the defiance, the performance of someone who needed to prove something. The victory that carries weight is the one that comes when you know, with the kind of knowledge that belongs only to people who have had to build from nothing, that what you are is genuinely yours. Not because anyone gave it to you, not because circumstances were arranged in your favor, because you located it yourself, in silence, under pressure, without a net, in the one place no one else could reach it. There is a version of this conversation that ends with a list of action steps, something concrete and manageable that you can carry out of here and apply to tomorrow morning's schedule. That is not what this is. What this is, what Jung's framework always offers to those willing to receive it, is not a strategy. It is a reorientation, a way of seeing what has been happening to you that makes it less opaque, less simply terrible, less purely a story of lack. You've been in the school that most people never attend, not because it was chosen for you out of some larger design, but because the alternative was not available. And in that school, something has been happening to you that the comfortable curriculum does not offer. The question that remains, the only one that ultimately matters, is whether you are present enough to the process to let it complete. The self that is being forged in your particular conditions is not guaranteed. It requires your participation, your willingness to look at what lives in the silence instead of filling it, your willingness to hold the tension of injustice and agency without letting either collapse the other, your willingness to stay long enough inside the confrontation to find out what actually survives it. What survives it, according to Jung, is the only thing worth the name of personality. Not the accumulated performance, not the structure inherited from others' belief, not the identity that depends on the continuation of conditions that can change. What survives is what was always there, what the pressure did not create, but only revealed. That is not a small thing to leave a conversation with. If something in this landed, not inspired you, but recognized something, leave it in the comments. Not what you plan to do, what you already knew. We will keep going from here. Neuromystique, mapping the inner architecture of those who build in the dark.